Welcome back to Foliage Loft. My name is Liam, and today I'm going to talk about how this plant, the Dracaena Fragrans, changed my life. It's commonly also referred to as the Dracaena Massangiana. Some people will also call it a corn plant. But this is the start of my houseplant obsession. I picked this up about 3 years ago. So let me take you back to the day that I purchased this plant. I was at IKEA with my partner. We had just moved into our new apartment and we were actually there looking for some curtains. And just as we were about to leave the store, the plant section kind of caught my eye, and I kind of been thinking about getting a plant. Our new apartment was very nice, but there were some, cold feeling industrial floors. We have concrete floors downstairs. I was thinking that, a tropical plant would probably bring a little bit of color to the space, a little bit of warmth. And as I looked through the plant section, these Dracaenas immediately caught my eye. They were the biggest plants that they sold there, so kind of instantly my eye gravitated towards them. I think it was my first time ever seeing this kind of plant, or at least realizing that they existed. I think they're such a cool looking plant. They have these really long, kind of strappy leaves, and some of the leaves will have this stripe of lighter green variegation that runs through them. It's got this really cool texture on the stem. Kind of reminds me a little bit of bamboo. So it does take up a good amount of space. This one I have here is about 4 feet tall. Typically they're sold as a pair or as a trio. This one I have here is a trio. The first stem is about 1 foot tall. The second stem is about 2 to 3 feet tall, and the final stem is the largest one, and that one's about 4 feet tall. They can get a little bit larger than this indoors, but typically if you find these guys at a plant shop, they'll be about this size. For our living room, I kind of wanted a large plant to be kind of a centerpiece of the living room, and it worked great down there for a while. We did rearrange recently, and I did move it upstairs to our den, and it's been doing pretty well up here. So as wonderful as this plant is, I haven't really been the greatest plant parent to it. So yeah, I thought I would make a video, and hopefully you guys can learn from some of my beginner mistakes and be a better plant parent than I was. So my first mistake with this plant was bringing it home on a bitter cold Canadian winter day. These plants are very sensitive to the cold. If the temperature drops below 10 degrees Celsius, this plant is not going to do well and will suffer very quickly. Thankfully, I only had it outside, from the door of IKEA to my car, and it was only about, a minute or so, and I got lucky. So somehow I made it home with the plant in one piece. I did look up some basic care instructions for the plant, so I knew that it really wanted some bright indirect light. So I did put it in a south-facing window about 5 to 6 feet away from the window. So it did get a lot of light, and it did really well there. So fast forward a few months and things were not going so hot. I was just watering this plant with regular tap water, and a lot of plants will be okay with that, no problem. But this plant is a little bit more sensitive to some of the minerals and some of the chemicals that you can find in tap water, and these plants do not like that. Some of those chemicals will actually build up in the leaves. There's no way for the plant to get rid of those chemicals, and what you will see is some of these brown tips here. But once I started watering this guy with distilled water, he started to do a lot better. So another mistake I made with this plant was when I tried to propagate it. So propagation is a very simple process in where you would take a cutting from a plant and you would try to grow a new plant out of that cutting. I did it right. I cut the stem in the right spot, but I did not do it at the right time of year. So winter is not a good time to propagate plants. Typically there's less sunlight, and obviously plants use sunlight as energy. So there's not enough energy in the winter available to the plant to develop roots on a cutting. So I think you can see here underneath the cut that I made, some new growth points did appear on the plant, but because of my next mistake, they never really fully formed and just kind of remained these little stunted bumps. So the next mistake I made was when I tried to repot this plant. You would expect a large plant like a Dracaena like this to have a pretty big root system, but in fact the root system on these plants are very, very small. Some of the roots were only 6 to 8 inches long. not very thick, and there was a surprisingly small number of roots when I removed them from the soil. This plant originally came in a 10-inch pot, and I went from a 10-inch size to a 14-inch size, which I thought was a pretty reasonable jump, but this pot was actually far too big for this plant. In hindsight, I probably should have just allowed this plant to stay in its original pot and maybe put that kind of ugly plastic pot inside of a cover pot. My poor Dracaena did develop some root rot after this. This happens when the soil is too wet and the roots don't have access to the oxygen that the plant needs. The plant stopped growing, had some kind of really ugly patches of brown develop on the leaves, and just overall was not doing very well. But luckily I did intervene at the right time. I pulled the entire plant out of the soil, completely got rid of all that peat-based potting mix, and I replaced that soil with a mixture of coco coir and pumice, which is my preferred soil mix. And this soil mix, it will dry out a lot faster, I find, than a lot of peat-based, like a general potting mix. Ever since I've done that, the plant has been so much happier. You can probably start to see on a few of the stems here that there is new growth and new healthy leaves are appearing, especially on the shortest stem that I have. I think the other two are just taking a little bit longer to dry out, but I am seeing a little bit of new growth on the larger stems as well. Yeah, looking back, I probably should have just left this plant in its original pot. If you buy a plant like this, Dracaena, from a plant shop, you can probably just leave it inside the pot that it came in for at least 2 or 3 years before you even need to consider repotting it. If you do leave it in the pot that you bought it in, I would just add some fertilizer every now and again in the growing season. You could either add a liquid fertilizer and add that to the water that you give the plant, or you could also add in a top layer of organic compost like worm castings. And I find that these plants, they're not really super picky about humidity, so regular household humidity, maybe like 30% or 40%, these plants are going to be just fine with that. In the winter, maybe keep an eye on your humidity levels. Typically when the furnace kicks in or you have radiators in the house, that will kind of dry out some of the air. So just be careful in the winter, but if you have normal household humidity, you should be just fine with a Dracaena like this. IKEA is not the first place I would recommend if you're gonna get a new houseplant. I would definitely go to a dedicated plant shop instead. You will get better customer service, more expertise in their help that they can give you, and you'll probably end up with a much healthier plant overall. If you do purchase from IKEA or another big box store, I would take a close look at the plant, take a look under the leaves and down the stem, make sure nothing's like soft or mushy or brown or yellow, and definitely take a look to see if there's any pests around the plant as well. If you see any kind of little bugs flying around or little white bugs on the leaves, definitely avoid those plants. My houseplant obsession really took off this year, being stuck at home a lot because of the lockdowns. But yeah, it all started right here for me. It took a while. I got this guy about 3 years ago, and somehow I still have him alive. But yeah, this year my collection really expanded. I think now I'm up over 50 plants, and it's just growing all the time. So hopefully you enjoyed the story about how my houseplant obsession started, and hopefully you guys will also, if you do get a plant like this Dracaena here, you'll learn from some of my beginner mistakes as well. Thank you so much if you watched this far into the video. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and have a great day. See ya.